In the crowded chaos of the morning bus route, 17-year-old Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his worn backpack clutched close as the city scenery blurred past the window. It was just another Tuesday morning, or at least that's what he thought until he heard the commotion 3 rows behind him. Through the reflection in the window, he could see an elderly black woman, probably in her 70s, struggling to keep her balance as she carried multiple grocery bags. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back, and despite the early hour, she was dressed impeccably in a purple church dress. The bus was packed, yet nobody seemed willing to give up their seat. What happened next made Michael's blood boil. A group of rowdy teenagers started making snide remarks, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear but not quite loud enough to draw the driver's attention. The woman kept her eyes down, her knuckles white as she gripped the handrail tighter. Michael wasn't the biggest kid in his high school. In fact, he often felt invisible in the hallways. His mom always said he was built like a runner, not a fighter. But something inside him snapped that morning. Maybe it was remembering how his grandmother used to struggle with her arthritis. Or maybe it was just basic human decency kicking in. Standing up, his heart pounding against his ribs, Michael made his way through the narrow aisle. The woman reminded him so much of Mrs. Thompson, the librarian who'd always sneak him extra time with the computers after school when his family couldn't afford one at home. Without hesitation, he offered his seat, but he didn't stop there. "Hey," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice surprisingly steady. "I think we can do better than this. There are at least 5 empty seats being taken up by backpacks right now." The bus fell silent. Michael could feel his face burning, but he stood his ground, making eye contact with each person holding a bag on an empty seat. What happened next would change Michael's life forever, though he didn't know it at the time. The elderly woman, as it turned out, wasn't just any regular bus passenger. Her name was Catherine Miller, and she had built one of the city's most successful real estate empires from nothing. She had been riding the bus that morning because her driver had called in sick, and she refused to let anything prevent her from visiting her great-grandchildren. That evening, Michael walked home from school like any other day, completely unaware that his simple act of kindness had set something extraordinary in motion. He didn't know that Mrs. Miller had spent the entire day making phone calls, tracking down which school the kind young man attended based on his uniform. He couldn't have guessed that his small act of courage would inspire Mrs. Miller to establish a scholarship program for students who demonstrate exceptional character, and he certainly had no idea that the next morning, as he trudged sleepily toward his first period class, a gleaming black Mercedes would be parked in the school's visitor lot. But perhaps most importantly, Michael didn't realize that his story would become a symbol of hope in a world that desperately needed it. A reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples that turn into waves of change. As the sun set on that Tuesday evening, Michael sat at his desk, working on his math homework and wondering if he'd have enough time to help his mom with dinner before starting his history project. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and the message preview made his heart skip a beat. "Thank you for today. You reminded an old woman that there's still good in this world. Get ready, young man. Your life is about to change." Little did Michael know, tomorrow would be the day that would prove no act of kindness, no matter how small, ever goes unnoticed. And sometimes, those acts come back to change your life in ways you never could have imagined. The next morning started like any other for Michael. He wolfed down a bowl of cereal while his mom rushed to get his younger sister ready for elementary school. Their small apartment was filled with the usual morning chaos. His sister couldn't find her favorite hair ribbon, and his mom was already running late for her shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. "Michael, honey, can you walk Sarah to school today?" His mom asked, attempting to fix her badge while simultaneously helping Sarah with her shoelaces. "I got called in early, and Mrs. Parker next door isn't feeling well." Michael nodded, quickly stuffing his math homework into his backpack. He never complained about helping out, not since his dad had passed away 3 years ago, leaving them to figure things out on their own. The mysterious text from last night still played on his mind as he and Sarah made their way through the crisp morning air. He'd shown it to his mom, who'd been equally puzzled but had cautioned him about responding to unknown numbers. Still, something about the message felt different, almost magical in its possibility. As they rounded the corner to Sarah's elementary school, she tugged on his sleeve. "Look, Mike, that car is so shiny," she exclaimed, pointing at a sleek black Mercedes that glided past them. Michael barely paid attention, too busy making sure his sister safely joined her friends at the school entrance. But when he arrived at his own school 20 minutes later, that same Mercedes was parked in the visitor's lot, drawing curious stares from students and teachers alike. Michael's heart began to race as he noticed a small group of people gathered near the main entrance, including his principal, Mr. Rodriguez, who rarely came out of his office before lunch. Standing among them was the elderly woman from the bus, but she looked different now. Gone was the purple church dress, replaced by an elegant business suit that spoke of authority and success. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and despite her age, she stood tall with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention. "There he is," she said warmly as Michael approached, causing everyone to turn and look at him. His face flushed red as Mr. Rodriguez gestured for him to join them. Michael's worn sneakers suddenly felt very out of place on the freshly polished floor of the school entrance. Catherine Miller, as she properly introduced herself, spoke with a voice that carried years of wisdom and determination. "Young man, what you did yesterday might seem small to you, but it represents something much bigger. In all my years in business, I've learned that character cannot be bought or taught. It simply is." Michael shifted uncomfortably, very aware of the growing crowd of students watching from the hallway. His best friend Tyler had stopped mid-stride, mouth agape, probably wondering why the quietest kid in school was suddenly the center of attention. "I spent last night thinking about how to properly acknowledge what you did," Mrs. Miller continued, her eyes twinkling with something that looked like mischief. "Money is easy to give, but I wanted to do something more meaningful. Something that could change not just your life, but the lives of others." She paused, creating a moment of suspense that had even the teachers leaning in closer. "But before I tell you what I have in mind, I'd like to know more about you, Michael. Would you and your mother be willing to join me for dinner tonight?" The principal beamed proudly, already nodding as if answering for Michael. But Mrs. Miller raised her hand gently. "This needs to be his decision. Mr. Rodriguez. No pressure, young man. Though I must say, my chef makes an excellent chocolate souffle." Michael's mind raced. His mom would be working the night shift, and Sarah needed help with her science project. As if reading his thoughts, Mrs. Miller added softly, "Of course, your sister would be more than welcome to join us. I have great-grandchildren her age who would love to meet her." Standing there, surrounded by expectant faces, Michael felt like he was in a dream. But the weight of his worn backpack, the familiar smell of the school hallway, and the morning announcements crackling over the intercom told him this was very real. He opened his mouth to respond, knowing his next words could change everything. That evening, Michael found himself sitting in one of the most elegant dining rooms he'd ever seen, trying to remember which fork to use first. His sister Sarah sat next to him, wide-eyed at the crystal chandelier that hung above the massive mahogany table. Their mother, who had managed to switch shifts with a coworker, looked equally amazed but was doing a better job of hiding it. Mrs. Miller's home was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd built a real estate empire, impressive but not showy, elegant but somehow still warm and inviting. Family photos lined the walls, telling the story of a life well lived. The smell of something incredible wafting from the kitchen made Michael's stomach growl, reminding him that he'd been too nervous to eat lunch. "So, Michael," Mrs. Miller began, as her chef served what she called appetizers but looked more like artwork on a plate, "tell me about your dreams. What does the future look like in your mind?" The question caught him off guard. Nobody except his mom had ever really asked him that before. Michael glanced at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod. I want to study engineering," he said quietly, then found his voice growing stronger. "I want to design things that help people. Maybe buildings that are more accessible for elderly people, or better public transportation systems." He looked down at his plate, feeling his face grow warm. "I know it sounds kind of silly." "Silly?" Mrs. Miller's voice carried a mix of surprise and delight. "Young man, do you know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who didn't just help an old woman on a bus. I see someone who recognized a problem and took action to solve it. That's exactly what this world needs more of." She stood up slowly, walking to a nearby desk where a thick folder sat. "I've spent the day talking to your teachers, Michael. They tell me you're one of the brightest students they've had, despite working part-time at the grocery store to help your mother." Michael's mom wiped a tear from her eye, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "But what really caught my attention," Mrs. Miller continued, "was what your classmates said about you. How you stay after school to tutor younger students. How you fix the wheelchair ramp at the library entrance when the city wouldn't do it. How you never seek recognition for any of it." Sarah piped up, "That's because my brother's a superhero." The adults laughed, but Mrs. Miller's eyes remained serious. "Your sister might be onto something there," she said, picking up the folder. "Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They just offer their seat on a bus." The folder in her hands suddenly seemed to hold the weight of the world. Michael could see official-looking papers inside, glimpses of letterheads from prestigious universities, and what looked like legal documents. His heart began to race. "Michael," Mrs. Miller said, her voice taking on a tone that commanded attention, "what I'm about to offer you isn't just about money for college, though that's part of it. It's about creating a legacy. A chance to help not just yourself, but others like you who have the heart and mind to change the world but lack the resources to do it." She paused, looking at each person at the table in turn. "But before I open this folder, I need you to understand something crucial. This opportunity comes with significant responsibility. Are you ready to hear what's inside?" The room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of an antique clock. Michael's mom held her breath. Sarah stopped swinging her legs under the table, and even the chef, who had just entered with the main course, froze in place. The weight of the moment pressed down on Michael's shoulders as Mrs. Miller's fingers gripped the edge of the folder, ready to reveal its contents. Just as Mrs. Miller began to open the folder, her butler appeared at the doorway, his usual composed demeanor notably disturbed. "Madam, I apologize for the interruption, but there's an urgent situation that requires your immediate attention." He glanced meaningfully at a tablet in his hands, then back at her. Mrs. Miller's expression shifted subtly as she read the screen. "I see," she said quietly, placing the folder back on the table. "It seems our competition has discovered our plans sooner than expected." She turned to Michael and his family, her warm smile returning, but now tinged with concern. "What I'm about to tell you will help you understand why this opportunity is bigger than just a scholarship," she began. "For years, I've watched other successful businesses focus solely on profits, forgetting the human element that makes communities thrive. I've been secretly developing a program, not just to help promising students like you, Michael, but to revolutionize how corporate America invests in communities." She walked to the window, gazing out at the city lights. "The folder contains plans for the Next Generation Initiative, a program that would identify young people who demonstrate exceptional character and provide them not just with education, but with mentorship, resources, and eventually positions of influence in major companies." Michael's mother leaned forward. "But why, Michael? Why us?" Her voice carried both hope and protective concern. Mrs. Miller turned back to face them, her eyes sharp with determination. "Because your son did something extraordinary in the most ordinary situation. He showed courage when it was easier to remain silent. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need." But there was more. The butler handed Mrs. Miller the tablet again, and her face tightened. "Unfortunately, there are powerful people who believe that success should remain in the hands of a privileged few. They've discovered our initiative and are trying to shut it down before it begins. Right now, my lawyers are fighting to protect everything we've built." Sarah, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "Like the bad guys in my comic books?" she asked innocently. Mrs. Miller couldn't help but smile. "Something like that, dear. But in real life, the bad guys usually hide behind fancy suits and legal documents." "Michael," Mrs. Miller continued, her voice taking on an urgent tone, "what I'm about to offer you isn't just a chance to change your life. It's an opportunity to be part of something that could change thousands of lives. But it comes with risks. The people opposing us, they'll try to discredit anyone involved with this program." The room felt electric with tension. Michael looked at his mother, seeing both fear and pride in her eyes. He thought about his father, who had always taught him that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Mrs. Miller reached for the folder again, but this time with a different energy. "Before I show you what's in here, I need to know, are you willing to fight for something bigger than yourself? Because once you see what's in this folder, there's no going back. The choice has to be yours, Michael." The butler's phone buzzed again, adding another layer of urgency to the moment. Through the window, Michael could see more cars pulling into the driveway, expensive ones with tinted windows. Mrs. Miller's security team seemed to be increasing their presence around the house. Michael stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Everyone turned to look at him, waiting for his response. The weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders, but somehow he felt stronger than ever. He opened his mouth to speak, knowing his next words would not just change his life, but potentially the lives of countless others. "I'll do it," Michael said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Not just for me, but for every kid who's ever done the right thing when no one was looking." His mother squeezed his hand, tears glistening in her eyes. Even Sarah sat up straighter, seeming to understand the gravity of the moment. Mrs. Miller smiled, but before she could open the folder, the butler rushed in again. "They're here," he announced, just as the sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside. Through the window, Michael could see men in expensive suits approaching the house, led by a familiar face that made his stomach drop. Mr. Harrison, the CEO of the city's largest development company. "Right on time," Mrs. Miller said, surprising everyone with a slight smirk. She pressed a button on her phone, and suddenly, the dining room's walls lit up with hidden screens. Live news feeds appeared, showing reporters gathering outside the estate's gates. "You see, Michael, I didn't just invite you to dinner tonight. I invited them too." The doors opened, and Mr. Harrison strode in, flanked by lawyers clutching briefcases. "Catherine, you can't do this," he began, but stopped short when he saw the cameras now recording through the windows. Mrs. Miller had orchestrated everything perfectly. "Actually, Richard," she said calmly, "I already have. Ladies and gentlemen," she addressed the cameras, "welcome to the launch of the Next Generation Initiative." She opened the folder at last, revealing not just scholarship papers, but detailed plans for a nationwide program that would identify and support young people who demonstrated exceptional character and leadership. "For too long, success has been measured by profit margins instead of human impact," she announced. "Tonight, we're changing that. And our first recipient," she turned to Michael, "showed us exactly why this program is necessary. He reminded us that true leadership isn't about power or money. It's about standing up for what's right, even when no one expects you to." Mr. Harrison's face reddened. "You're making a mistake, Catherine. The board won't approve this." But Mrs. Miller just smiled wider. "The board already has, Richard. In fact," she gestured to her tablet, "they're voting right now to remove you as CEO. Your attempt to block this initiative was the last straw." Michael watched in amazement as the story unfolded on the news screens. His simple act of kindness on a bus had sparked a corporate revolution, but Mrs. Miller wasn't finished. She turned to Michael's mother. "And you, my dear, are looking at the new head of our community outreach program, if you'll accept the position." Tears flowed freely now as Michael's mom nodded, unable to speak. Sarah jumped up and down, finally understanding that their lives were changing forever. But the biggest surprise was still to come. Mrs. Miller handed Michael a special envelope from the folder. "This isn't just a scholarship, Michael. It's an invitation to join our junior board of directors. Your voice, your perspective on what real leadership looks like, that's what we need to change the future." As cameras flashed and reporters clamored outside, Michael opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter that began, "Dear Michael, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can start the biggest revolutions." But just as he started to read further, a commotion arose from the security team outside. Someone else was arriving. someone whose presence would add one final incredible twist to this already extraordinary evening. Through the window, Michael could see another car pulling up, and the person stepping out made his heart stop. Through the grand doors walked Michael's high school principal, Mr. Rodriguez, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came streaming in the very teenagers from the bus who had mocked the elderly woman, now looking sheepish and transformed. Their presence brought a hushed silence to the room, but Mrs. Miller's smile only grew wider. "Perfect timing," she said, nodding to Mr. Rodriguez. "Michael, remember how I said this was about more than just you. These young people have something they'd like to share." The teenagers stepped forward, led by a tall boy who had been the loudest in his mockery that day on the bus. "We've been in the principal's office all afternoon," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "After what happened this morning, when everyone at school was talking about what you did, well, it made us think. We've been working with Mr. Rodriguez to start an anti-bullying program at school. We want to be part of the change, too." Mrs. Miller stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "And they will be. Part of the Next Generation initiative includes a youth mentorship program. These young people will work with elementary school students, teaching them about kindness, respect, and standing up for what's right." Michael's simple act of courage hadn't just changed his life. It had created a ripple effect throughout the entire community. As cameras continued to flash outside, Mrs. Miller gathered everyone together. "This is what real change looks like," she announced to the reporters. "It starts with one person doing the right thing, and it grows into something bigger than any of us." 1 year later, Michael stood at a podium, addressing a crowd of students, business leaders, and community members. The Next Generation initiative had grown beyond anyone's expectations, spreading to cities across the country. His mother now ran one of the largest community outreach programs in the state, and Sarah had started a Kids for Kindness club at her elementary school. "Sometimes people ask me if I knew what would happen that morning on the bus," Michael said to the audience. "The truth is, I wasn't thinking about scholarships or programs or changing the world. I was just thinking about my grandmother and what she always told me. In a world where you can be anything, be kind." The crowd burst into applause as Michael gestured to the group of students behind him, the first nationwide class of Next Generation Initiative scholars. Among them were faces from every background, each with their own story of everyday courage and kindness. Mr. Harrison, who had initially opposed the program, had become one of its strongest supporters after seeing its impact. He sat in the audience now, nodding approvingly. Sometimes Michael realized even those who start as opponents can become allies when they see the power of positive change. As the ceremony concluded, Mrs. Miller joined Michael on stage, looking as elegant as ever. "When I got on that bus last year," she whispered to him, "I was testing someone's theory that the younger generation had lost its way. You proved them wrong, Michael. You proved that kindness isn't lost. Sometimes it just needs a chance to shine." Later that evening, as Michael rode the bus home, yes, he still took the bus, despite now having a college fund and a promising future. He smiled at a young girl who offered her seat to an elderly man. The man declined politely, but the gesture itself made Michael's heart warm. The ripple effect continued, one small act of kindness at a time. Because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up, one moment of courage, to remind the world that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just ride the bus, carrying backpacks and dreams, ready to prove that the smallest acts of kindness can spark the biggest changes in the world.